It was the longest war in U.S. history, spanning an era that saw the Alamo, the Mexican-American War, and the Civil War come and go. It was the 60 years of ongoing battles, fights, and raids that took place between the Great Plains nomadic horse warriors and settlers, traders, and the United States military. With as many as 20,000 casualties on each side, it made the wild, wild West a dangerous and violent place. It is simply called the Indian Wars. In the battle for the North American continent, between the native peoples and the Euro-Americans, nothing has fueled the emotions and imagination more than the massacres on both sides during the Indian Wars in the second half of the 19th century. However, these were only the final chapter in a bitter 250-year struggle. Prior to colonial settlement along the eastern seaboard, there were many Indian nations distributed throughout what would eventually become the United States of America. Three important groups controlled the region east of the Appalachian Mountains. First, the Iroquois League held the balance of power in eastern North America until the end of the 18th century. Next, the Powhatan Confederacy held power over the middle and South Atlantic coast, including present-day Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. The largest group, the Algonquian-speaking tribes, lived both east and west of the Appalachian Mountains. They formed a less powerful group that dominated the Great Lakes region and part of the Mid-Atlantic area. Further to the south and west were the Alabama, Caddo, and Tunica. Many of these tribes initially helped the colonists to thrive in the harsh conditions of North America, often symbolized by the first Thanksgiving in 1621 at Plymouth, Massachusetts. After that, the relationship between the colonists and Indians soon turned confrontational. At first, these hostilities took the form of skirmishes along the frontier, but soon evolved into wars. The first was the Pequot War in 1637. Fought in Connecticut and Rhode Island, it established a pattern for subsequent Native American warfare. When the Pequot refused to give up Indians who had murdered a white trader, the Puritans retaliated by attacking the principal Pequot settlement. Whites burned the village and slaughtered over 500 of its inhabitants. The surviving Pequot were relentlessly pursued until killed or driven out of the area. 40 years later, this strategy was used again in King Philip's War, 1675 through 76, to keep New England colonists from being driven into the sea. King Philip was given the name by the Puritans to a Wampanoag chief, Metacom. Though the Wampanoag were generally peaceful, King Philip resented white intrusions into their territory. In 1675, he led his tribe against the colonies of Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. The Indian raiding parties burned several New England towns, killed and captured hundreds of colonists, and almost succeeded in driving the Europeans out of New England completely. But colonial soldiers finally ended the threat by destroying the Indian villages and killing King Philip. The destructiveness of the war led to the idea that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. long before it was attributed to General Phil Sheridan nearly 200 years later. Perhaps 1,000 colonists lost their lives, and the percentage of loss as compared to the total population made Philip's War the most devastating in American history. Never again would the Native Americans come as close to kicking out the Europeans from North America. Far to the southwest, Spanish priests and settlers pushed into the desert occupied by the Navajo, Apache, and Pueblo. Conquering the Pueblo, the Spanish tried to enslave them and convert them to Christianity. This worked for the better part of the 17th century, until in 1680, a charismatic medicine man, Pope, led the Pueblos in revolt against their Spanish overlords. They slaughtered 400 missionaries and settlers and forced the remaining colonists and their families to flee south to Mexico. It was this rebellion that released the Spanish horse onto the plains. Horses that went on to make up the wild Mustang herds that formed the nucleus of the nomadic Plains Indian warrior horse culture. In 1689, the Spanish came back in force and put down the rebellion, retaking Santa Fe in 1692. But the genie had been released from the bottle. The nomadic warrior culture was already underway. Dramatized in James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans, the French and Indian War saw the native tribes fight on both sides of the 7-year conflict between the French and the British. The Iroquois joined the British, and the Algonquin Indians fought on the side of the French. Indeed, the French relied heavily on their Indian allies, even adopting their guerrilla-style warfare. But Britain's greater numbers and superior military minds and strategies defeated France by 1763. The French ceded all of Canada and eastern Louisiana to Britain. Dismayed at losing their ancestral lands, several Native American nations, under the leadership of Ottawa Chief Pontiac, continued to fight. Pontiac's words showed the determination of the Indians. It is important for us, my brothers, that we exterminate from this land this nation which seeks to destroy us. When the English are defeated, we shall stop up the ways hither so that they may never come upon our lands again. In what became known as Pontiac's War, the Chippewa, Seneca, and Delaware, among others, launched attacks on British outposts, overrunning garrisons at Sandusky, Ohio, Fort Wayne, Indiana, Niles, Michigan, Fort Michilimackinac on the straits between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. The ferocity and swiftness of the Indians' attacks nearly succeeded in forcing the British out of the territory west of the Appalachians. But the British sent reinforcements to their beleaguered garrisons at Fort Pitt and Fort Detroit. Meanwhile, the French refused aid to Pontiac. In 1766, the Indians finally agreed to peace. Pontiac's War was the greatest stand by Native Americans until the Plains Indians' War 100 years later. During those 100 years, Native American nations east of the Mississippi River battled with American military forces, but were never able to claim victory. For example, the Miami and Shawnee, under the war chief Little Turtle, tried to halt the onslaught of settlers streaming into the old Northwest Territory, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. They were nearly successful. In October 1791, Little Turtle's forces attacked General Arthur St. Clair on the Ohio-Indiana border near present-day Fort Recovery. St. Clair lost more than 800 of his 1,400 men. It was the greatest defeat ever suffered by an American military force, more than tripling Custer's losses at the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. However, at the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1794, General Mad Anthony Wayne's well-disciplined troops dealt the Indians a crushing defeat, forcing them to cede lands to the new United States government in the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. 15 years later, the celebrated Shawnee war chief Tecumseh and his brother, known as the Prophet, tried to organize a grand alliance of Indian nations throughout the Ohio River Valley to fight westward migration. But at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, General William Henry Harrison led a group of militia who destroyed any chance of Tecumseh's Confederation succeeding. Impressed by Tecumseh's oratory, the part-white William Weatherford, known as Red Eagle, led his Creek warriors against Fort Mims on the lower Alabama River in August 1813. The fort's small group of militia fought until all were killed, and the Creeks massacred all but about 36 out of the 500 settlers who had taken refuge in the fort. In 1814, General Andrew Jackson smashed Southern Indian resistance to white settlers at the Battle of the Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. 3 years later, he took on the Seminoles in the First Seminole War and chased them out of South Georgia and northern Florida. But the Seminoles would rise up against white settlers twice more from 1835 to 1842 and 1855 to 1858. Both times, they were defeated by American military forces. One of the last skirmishes east of the Mississippi River was Black Hawk's War. A Sauk Indian leader, Black Hawk, opposed giving Indian lands to whites. For 4 months, in the spring and summer of 1832, he led his band in a fight against American militia until his followers were virtually wiped out at Bad Axe River. By the 1850s, the Indian nations east of the Mississippi River lost their final battles with the U.S. government. However, from the time of the Pueblo uprising to the middle of the 19th century, a new kind of native culture developed on the continent. For the first time, Americans were about to be confronted by a true warrior culture. These were the 7 warrior Indian nations: the Navajo, Apache, the Kiowa, the Comanche, the Arapaho, the Cheyenne, and the Sioux that had migrated into the country's interior. True warrior cultures have been rare during Earth's history. The greatest honor for the one that arose on the American Central Plains was to count coup, or to touch an enemy. Those warriors who acquired this distinction were held in the highest regard. From the time of birth, young boys were steeped in this culture, and all boys, whether they became warriors, hunters, scouts, or shamans, learned the arts of war from an early age. In fact, the way of the warriors started before birth. From the moment a woman became pregnant, she prepared her child for survival by making amulets that would protect him. These amulets were often in the shape of a lizard or a turtle. As for the fathers, once their sons were born, they made small weapons for them to play with. And when the child could stand, he gave him a bow. Growing up, boys played games that tested their skill with weapons. One game, the hoop game, had young boys shooting arrows at a rolling hoop of wood. Once a boy was old enough, his father gave him a colt and instructed him on how to ride and care for it. Around puberty, advanced warrior training began. They ran and swam for endurance, threw lances and shot arrows for skill, learned the art of making weapons, finally learning to shoot arrows from any position, even while riding a horse. Often a young warrior was left alone on the prairie. There he learned to fend for himself, know every animal track, find water where there was none, learned how to spot an enemy's trail, know what they were carrying, where they were going. Once these skills of riding, using weapons, survival, and tracking were conquered, the young warrior had to master the art of war. He did this by accompanying older warriors on raids for horses, or perhaps even in battle. The kind of warfare he was learning would in today's language be called guerrilla warfare. It especially included the art of ambush. With his training over, the life of a warrior might look like this. In his teens, he would be given more responsibilities, such as protecting the horse herds. At age 15 or so, a promising warrior candidate might be invited to join a warrior society. At 17, he might steal a horse or take a scalp. By 19, he would undergo his first sun dance ceremony, and by his mid-20s lead his first war party. At age 30, with his young blood days behind him, he would begin to withdraw from warrior status and give himself over to the hunt. The most frequent purpose of a raid was to get more horses. A raid was usually prompted by a dream that guided a warrior to action. For example, Sitting Bull used his dreams to foretell the defeat of Custer at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. The leader of the raiding party was known as the pipe holder and generally was well acquainted with the landmarks and watering holes of the enemy territory. Raiders were scrupulous about following their dreams to the letter. If something was not right, or if an omen proved bad, the raid would be called off. Kiowa raiders were known to turn back at the sound of an owl hooting because the owl was considered a bird of ill omen. The simple raiding party consisted of 4 to 20 warriors. War parties were much larger. They could number in the hundreds of warriors. Raiders would be away from camp anywhere from 2 weeks to several months. The typical raiding party traveled in single file with the pipe leader in front, the more experienced riders next, and the neophytes last. Often scouts would ride ahead to make certain the way was clear. Before an attack or ambush, the warriors prepared themselves for battle, donning headdresses and painting their faces. Their individualized attack strategy, a strategy that embodied the warrior ethos, worked well against fellow Indian nations, but failed them in their later conflicts with the United States military. While a war party approached the camp as a unit, once a battle commenced, any thought of cooperation flew away, and every warrior fought for individual honors. On these raids, a warrior would have a full complement of weapons. The weapon of choice for the Plains Indian warrior was the bow and arrow. They made two types of bows, a self-bow fashioned from a single piece of wood, and a composite bow manufactured from layers of wood, bone, or horn, glued and lashed together with sinew. Warriors also made composite recurve bows that were so powerful that they could send an arrow completely through a buffalo. Bowstrings were made from sinew or rawhide strips. Most bows were from 3 to 3.5 feet in length and took at least a month to make. Usually warriors carried 2 or more bows when raiding. Bows were only as good as the arrows they shot, and warriors took special pains to ensure their arrows would fly straight and true. They used wood, plentiful on the plains, including gooseberry, ash, birch, cane, dogwood, currant, osage orange, and willow. They measured on the average 25.5 inches in length. Each arrow bore the owner's distinctive marks. Arrowheads were the most intriguing part of the arrow. Most Indians in the Plains Wars did not use stone points. Instead, the Plains warrior used iron tips obtained from the whites in trade or raids. When a wagon train was captured or a farmstead raided, iron barrel bands were taken as prime loot because one band could yield up to 20 arrowheads. Quivers held the bows and arrows. Like all the Plains warriors' belongings, the quiver was usually decorated with beads, quills, and animal skins. However, the arsenal of the Plains warrior was not limited to bows and arrows. From an early age, warriors were taught to fight with a variety of weapons, including lances, knives, clubs, and hatchets. All of these weapons were usually highly decorated with eagle feathers, animal skins, or quills. The knife was the most versatile weapon a warrior had, and could be used in a variety of tasks, from hunting and food preparation to killing an enemy. The earliest knives of the Plains Indians came from stone and were exceedingly sharp, able to cut meat precisely or take a scalp. But they dulled quickly, and during the Indian Wars, metal blades soon surpassed flint knives. And of course, warriors carried a war club for close-in fighting. With the introduction of the horse, club handles increased in length so that a warrior could strike an enemy while mounted on his horse. Club heads were first made from stone or buffalo horn, but the more famous and readily identifiable hatchets and tomahawk pipes were made from iron. Nothing struck fear in the heart of a settler or a cavalryman more than an Indian warrior charging with a tomahawk raised. Finally, as early as the mid-17th century, Indians obtained muskets through trading or raiding. By the time the Plains Indian culture arose, Rifles were part of every trading company's stock, and just prior to the Indian Wars, every Indian nation possessed firearms. Still, the warrior on horseback with his bow and arrows was the Earth's most effective fighting machine at that time. After years of fighting each other, the Plains Indians were about to test their warrior skills against the advancing American frontier. By 1850, the Plains Indian nations had settled into relatively stable territories. The Oregon and Santa Fe trails were carrying tons of trade goods and tens of thousands of settlers and miners to the west coast. The U.S. government's dragoons and mounted riflemen were building a series of forts along these travel routes. At that time, raids by the nomadic tribes on settlers moving west were few. Then in 1854, all hell broke loose when Lieutenant John Grattan and a patrol of 29 men from Fort Laramie went to a Lakota Sioux village to arrest a warrior accused of stealing a cow. The soldiers unexpectedly opened fire. The Sioux retaliated, massacring every member of Grattan's patrol. In an instant, the carefully crafted peace of the 1851 Laramie Treaty was shattered, and the Plains were engulfed in war. The Sioux were the largest of the Indian nations extended across the Plains. They were divided into three groups: Dakota, Nakota, and Lakota. The Lakota, or Teton Sioux, were by far the largest and most successful warriors. They were the truest of the warrior cultures. So it was ironic that the event, which had the greatest influence in shaping white sentiment against the Plains Indians, took place in Minnesota by the last group to adopt the horse, the Dakota, or Santee Sioux. In fact, the Santee Sioux used horses much in the manner of the mounted rifle companies, dismounting from their horses to engage in battle. The Santee were a woodland group of Indians, which had been pushed west onto reservations along the Minnesota River. And what was to become known as the Minnesota Massacre, or the Sioux Uprising, more whites were killed than in any other Indian war conflict west of the Mississippi. It began on August 17, 1862, when 4 Sioux hunters attacked a white farm family near Acton, Minnesota, killing the father, mother, and a daughter. For the next month, the Sioux rampaged against settlers, farms, and towns, killing 644 whites and capturing nearly 300 men, women, and children. The Santee chief, Little Crow, now declared that the war had begun. Little Crow knew the Santee had little chance of winning. However, he told his warriors, "Little Crow is not a coward. He will die with you." Other Santee war chiefs, Mankato, Big Eagle, Shakopee, and Graybeard, also declared for war. The time to reclaim their land had arrived, and for the next month, southwestern Minnesota was aflame with fighting.
And as the uprising developed, the Indians had attacked both the upper and the lower agency. Some of the survivors that escaped those attacks managed to reach Fort Ridgely and bring the commander there, Captain John Marsh, the word of what had happened. Marsh was suspicious that the reports were exaggerated, but felt nonetheless that it would be necessary for him to investigate. So he marched from Fort Ridgely with a force of 46 men and one interpreter. When he reached the Redwood Ferry across from the lower agency, his force was attacked by Indians concealed in the brush along both sides of the river. In the fight that followed, approximately half of Marsh's command were killed, including Marsh himself, who drowned in the river. The remainder of his force managed to return to Fort Ridgely.
In the course of the uprising, the Sioux mostly attacked undefended farms and small settlements. But in 2 instances, they attacked a large town and an army post.
Following the attack on Redwood Ferry, on Marsh's command at Redwood Ferry, the Indians could not agree as to whether they should attack Fort Ridgely or New Ulm. Little Crow was of the opinion that they needed to attack Fort Ridgely, but he was outvoted by the majority of the warriors who wanted to attack New Ulm, seeing that there was a lot of plunder to be had in that community, which was then about 1,000 people. So the majority of the Indians then moved toward New Ulm. A stiff fight ensued, in which the Indians were eventually repulsed by the determination of the defenders, supported by some local militia from the surrounding areas. The following day, the Little Crow was able to muster a strong force of warriors. They attacked Fort Ridgely and were repulsed. And New Ulm itself was attacked a second time several days later. And again, the defenders were successful in repelling the Indians.
By the beginning of September, the tide of battle had swung against the Sioux. The final engagement took place at Wood Lake, Minnesota.
In late September, Colonel Sibley, who had been appointed military commander of the region by the governor of Minnesota, marched up the Minnesota River Valley with a force of approximately 1,600 men, composed mainly of volunteer regiments of Minnesota infantry that had been recalled from Civil War duty. On the 23rd of September, 1862, Sibley's force encountered Little Crow and his warriors, numbering perhaps as many as 1,000, in what has come to be known as the Battle of Wood Lake. The Indians were defeated.
After the defeat, Little Crow released his 269 women and children captives. Of the 2,000 warriors who surrendered, 393 were tried and 303 condemned to death by hanging. However, President Lincoln investigated the trials and the causes of the uprising and approved death sentences for only 39 of the 303 convicted Indians. One was later reprieved. These remaining 38 warriors were hung at Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862.
The uprising galvanized action throughout not just Minnesota, but throughout the region. Military action followed in 1863 and 1864, in which the survivors of Little Crow's army, if you want to think of it as that, Colonel Sibley and General Alfred Sully conducted campaigns pursuing the Indians out into Dakota Territory. In 1863, there were successful actions at Dead Buffalo Lake, uh, Whitestone Hill, and Kildare Mountain in 1864.
The consequences of the Minnesota Massacre would be felt farther west on the plains for the next 28 years, especially in Colorado at Sand Creek. Sometime around 1740, the Cheyenne Nation migrated onto the plains along the Missouri River in South Dakota. While still living as traditional woodland Indians, they had been preyed upon for decades by other tribes and nearly driven to extinction. That changed with the Great Horse Dispersal at the beginning of the century. Practically overnight, the Cheyenne became skilled horsemen. Now capable of handling their former enemies, the Sioux and Crow, they became formidable fighters. At the same time, they also became expert buffalo hunters. Adopting the Sioux teepee for living, the Cheyenne warrior hunter bands could now take their families with them when they needed to follow the buffalo. On the plains, the Cheyenne prospered and their numbers grew dramatically. Militarily, their strength also grew, first through an alliance with the Arapaho and later the Sioux. Together, they drove the Kiowa and the Crow out of the prized Black Hills of South Dakota. 75 years of nomadic life had turned the Cheyenne into a full-fledged warrior culture. In the early 19th century, the Cheyenne had become so successful, they were raiding the large Comanche horse herds south of the Arkansas River. During these raids, many of the Cheyenne fell in love with the region of Kansas and Colorado north of the Arkansas River. It was resplendent with tall grass prairie and buffalo. By 1825, over half of the Cheyenne Nation, joined by many Arapaho, had migrated into this buffalo-rich region permanently. The move was motivated by economics. The Cheyenne chief Yellow Wolf met with the Bent brothers, and together they created a highly lucrative trading partnership centered at Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River. For a time, all seemed well between the Southern Cheyenne and whites. So much so that White Antelope and Alights on the Cloud, two Cheyenne chiefs, met with President Fillmore in 1851 in Washington, D.C., as did another delegation, which included Cheyenne chiefs War Bonnet, Stand in the Water, and Lean Bear, who met with Abraham Lincoln during the height of the Civil War in March 1863. Oddly, soon after this second peace trip, widespread hostilities broke out among many Cheyenne and whites, while other Cheyenne were attempting to change and adopt the lifestyles of the whites. This paradox and confusion would lead to tragedy. After the Minnesota Massacre, where more than 600 settlers were slaughtered by the Santee Sioux in 1862, fear of the Indians on the plains ran high among whites. In Colorado, this fear was brought home on June 11, 1864.
June 9th, 10th, and 11th, there were Indian raids all around this area right here. On June 11th, at this site, the Hungate family was killed. Nathan Ward Hungate, 29 years old, Ellen, 25, and their two daughters, Laura and Florence. Laura not yet 3 and Florence not yet 5 months. They were killed here. Their bodies were then brought into Denver and displayed. They had been mutilated. Nathan was found about a mile or a mile and a half south of here along the creek, Running Creek, Box Elder Creek. These raids were done by Cheyenne, Kiowa, and Arapaho. Later, Arapaho were identified as the perpetrators of this killing, but it was always identified as a small number, maybe 4. But the evidence of the fire at the house in modern archaeology and the weapons found, there's evidence of 8 weapons that were used in a long siege here as they were burned out, shows that it had to be a large party, at least 20, maybe 60, and that they took the time to kill this family. Why did they do that? Probably because Nathan shot one of the Indians who was stealing stock, as there had been stock stolen all around this area on June 9th and 10th. And all of the reports of these Indians is that they were Arapaho, Kiowa, and Cheyenne. They were all armed, and there was no violence at all. The only violence was here. Violence occurs later in August on the Overland Trail, not far from Colorado and Nebraska, and 53 settlers are killed there. And that, along with the murder of the Hungate family, is what fueled the military expedition and the 3rd Volunteer Colorado Cavalry and Colonel John Chivington to attack Chief Black Kettle Cheyenne Village at Sand Creek on November 29, 1864.
A month earlier, near Fort Larned, Kansas, the Cheyenne chief Lean Bear, just back from his meeting with Lincoln, was gunned down by troopers as he approached, showing the peace medal given to him by the president. Using this attack as an excuse, the Cheyenne dog soldiers made settlers in Kansas and eastern Colorado pay a heavy price. Indeed, this attack added fuel to the raids the Cheyenne had already begun at the same time. In June 1864, Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans issued a proclamation directing friendly Indians to appear at the various U.S. government forts. 2 months later, the great Cheyenne chief Black Kettle requested a meeting with the commander of Fort Lyon, Major Edward Wynkoop. Wynkoop was highly impressed with Black Kettle. He later wrote, "The chief sat, dignified, immovable, with a slight smile on his face. A bond of mutual trust was formed between the 2 men. As a result, Black Kettle, White Antelope, and Bull Bear, one of the leaders of the dog soldiers, traveled to Denver to meet with Governor Evans and Colonel John M. Chivington for a council held at Camp Weld. Chivington, a former minister, was the military commander in Colorado Territory and nominal head of the 3rd Colorado Regiment, formed exclusively to hunt down Indians. At the meeting, Black Kettle said, "All we ask is that we may have peace with the whites. You are our father. We've been traveling through a cloud. The sky has been dark ever since the war began." In return, Evans accused the Cheyenne of initiating hostilities and said, "The time when you can make war best is in the summertime. When I can make war best is in the winter. You, so far, have had the advantage. My time is just coming." At the end of the conference, Chivington stated, "My rule of fighting white men or Indians is to fight them until they lay down their arms and submit to military authority. They're nearer Major Wynkoop than anyone else, and they can go to him when they get ready to do that." Ironically, both sides wanted peace, and yet the conference ended without any firm commitment to peace from either side. Indian historian D. Brown wrote that Black Kettle took Shivington's remarks to mean that Black Kettle's people would be safe if he brought them to Fort Lyon on the Arkansas River. However, other historians dispute this claim, pointing out that when the Indians went back to Fort Lyon, they stopped at the cattle ranch owned by John Prowers and told him they could not make any treaty of peace with them, meaning Evans and Shivington. On November 9th, 1864, Black Kettle and the Cheyenne began arriving at Fort Lyon. By this time, Wynkoop had been relieved of his command for being too soft on Indians, such as giving them food and supplies against orders. The new commander, Major Scott Anthony, directed Black Kettle and his band to camp 40 miles to the northeast on the Big Sandy, also known as Sand Creek. Meanwhile, Shivington had other plans.
Colonel Shivington, who had been at the Camp Weld Council in Denver in September '64, learned at that meeting that the Indians that he had been hunting for and hoping to kill for several years were probably camped at the Fort Lyon area or on the Big Sandy Creek nearby. In mid-November, he left Denver with his troops, headed downriver down the Arkansas to Fort Lyon, which he reached on the night of November 28th.
On November 28th, now in command of 700 troops armed with short-barreled carbines and pistols, and with 4 12-pound mountain howitzers, Shivington ordered his cavalry to march to Black Kettle's encampment.
There were probably 115, 120 teepees here, with maybe 500 men, women, and children. Shivington approached from the south, approached the village. Some of the Indians actually went out to meet him. As a matter of fact, some of the first casualties of the fight here were 2 Colorado troopers who were shot down off of their horses. There was no mass charge through this village. Shivington had dismounted his men, and they actually walked through the village, allowing the Indians to escape up creek and a little bit more to the northwest up the creek. The soldiers walked through the village. When they got to the far end, they saw the Indians fleeing, and it was at that time that many of the officers lost control of their men. And the men, almost on an individual basis, started going after the fleeing Indians. They chased them up creek for several miles. As they ran, the Indians dug in at points all along the creek bed, dug themselves homemade rifle pits to make little defensive positions. The soldiers chased them throughout the rest of the day on the 29th. The battle lasted from dawn up until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it was quite a long, drawn-out affair. There were quite a few casualties, more than we would think of. The soldiers took 76 casualties. That was about 25 killed and 51 wounded, which may not sound like a lot, but in the context of the Indian Wars, that was a heck of a fight. That was put Sand Creek up at the top of all the fights in the Indian Wars as per casualties. As for the Indians, that was pretty devastating to them also. They lost probably upwards of 150 killed. The things that distinguished Sand Creek here was afterwards, after the battle, the atrocities. Some of the men again lost control. They no doubt were angry. They had known what had happened through the rest of the summer with the Indian raiding, the massacre of the Hungate family in June outside of Denver, and the soldiers were taking vengeance. They had scalped and mutilated a lot of the Cheyenne bodies after the fight. I no doubt they saw this as a just vengeance and a great victory. For the Cheyennes, of course, they view the event as a massacre.
Miraculously, Black Kettle survived, even while returning to save his wounded wife. However, Shivington's massacre at Sand Creek elevated the Cheyenne military societies, particularly the Dog Soldiers, into power. Americans back east were horrified by the Sand Creek massacre. Lincoln removed Governor Evans, and 2 months after Sand Creek, Shivington was out of the service. Black Kettle's peace attempts had failed, and now the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux, enraged by Sand Creek, chose to make war to the knife. The massacres in Minnesota and Sand Creek inflamed passions on both sides, and for the next 26 years, there'd be a battle to the death for the Great Plains.